All right, and I think we're live. Just gonna wait for people to trickle in, assuming anyone gets these notifications, which is which is a dubious assumption most of the time. Don't want to go into another YouTube rant where I decry the way that YouTube runs. Suffice to say, I think David Wood has made a wise decision in migrating away from this platform. I think that applies not just to big creators such as him, but basically anyone who wants to have their message heard. I think YouTube is it has diminishing utility in that regard. So I think a lot of the uproar over him leaving is just constitutes people not understanding what his reasoning is and not really looking at what he's had to deal with over the past few years, particularly dealing with YouTube always threatening to delete his channel. So I think in the long run, this is going to be a good decision. It's going to it's going to come out for the furtherance of the gospel and for an increase in the number of Muslims being exposed to the truth. I think it'll just take a while for people to grasp what's happening. Hey, Alejandro. Okay, so someone, at least a few people have gotten my notifications. I know someone said it took them an hour last time to be notified of my live stream. By that point, it had already ended because I think it was a half hour long, and they were notified it was happening a half hour after it had ended. Hey, GW. So now that there are at least a few people here, I want to transition to my main subject, which is the way the media distorts everything. And you've seen this with the Uvalde shooting and the this manufactured debate about access to firearms. But I want to focus, if I could, on what's been happening over the past couple of months with regard to the Ukraine. So, Ukraine was invaded on February 24th, although here it was February 23rd, my birthday. And there was a certain media narrative that was established from the beginning of this conflict and that has persisted throughout. And I wanted to contrast that with how other atrocities are depicted and reported on, particularly in the US media. So you've been treated to countless descriptions of Russian attacks on civilians and atrocities. The idea of a genocide being enacted, that's something that's been repeated ad nauseum, particularly the remarks of Vladimir Zelensky, which have been amplified throughout the US and Western media. This idea that a genocide is occurring is something that's been repeated ad nauseum. And it's interesting when you look at the way that this has been reported, any sort of instance of Russian atrocities or Russian attacks on civilians. They've been shelling various cities, particularly in the east, in Luhansk and Donetsk. Uh, Kharkiv has been bombed. The capital, obviously, Kiev, has been bombed sporadically, although the assault on Kiev is pretty much over. But you've been treated to endless descriptions of this, even on local news media and local news channels, and yet you based on the media depiction, you would think that this was the only instance of war crimes, of warfare taking place. You would The amount of coverage devoted to this conflict outstrips any other dispute or war on the globe, even ones that have been occurring for much longer and have exacted a much costlier price on the participants. And a great example of this is what's happened in Nigeria. There was a woman, a Christian woman, who was immolated. She was burned to death by Muslim students at a university in Kano province in Nigeria, the northwesternmost province in that country. She was ostensibly attacked for posting messages on WhatsApp that were critical of Muhammad or questioning certain precepts of Islam. Now, very often Muslims will use this as a pretext to murder and to steal the property of non-Muslims, particularly Christians, in areas like Nigeria, where you have a mixed population, which is approximately half Christian and half Muslim. But what's been going on over the past 2 decades has been a literal genocide. Now, this this is the conflict between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria predates the 20th century. Obviously, there was a predominantly Igbo section of the country called Biafra, which tried to secede, and they were subjected to forced starvation, to famine, and relentlessly attacked by the military junta in control of the Nigerian government, which is staffed mostly by Muslims. Um, and but what you've been seeing over the past 2 decades has been a systematic plot to displace and kill the Christian population of Nigeria. They want to Islamize the entire country and to wipe out any vestiges of Christianity from Nigeria. And they've been doing this through a lot of means. Of course, you've heard of the kidnappings that Boko Haram has done, stealing schoolgirls and holding them hostage, subjecting them to horrific sexual abuse, and also trying to forcibly convert them to Islam. And this has been happening over the past few years, but there have also been repeated attacks and destruction of Christian cities, particularly in the borderlands between northern Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim, and southern Nigeria. And the the murder, the martyrdom of this Christian woman is simply one of the latest examples and one of the more horrific examples of a policy that's been put in place through a combination of the government, the Muslim government, and the Muslim population, what are often called Fulani tribesmen or herdsmen who encroach upon Christian lands and try to seize their farms. And also, jihadist groups like Boko Haram, ISWAP, Al Qaeda, various Muslim jihadist organizations within Nigeria itself. And this has resulted in the deaths of between 60 and 80,000 Christians. And this is an estimate. We don't even, it's been so widespread, we don't even have an accurate figure, but it's somewhere on the order of 80,000 Christians in Nigeria who've been ruthlessly murdered. That's not counting the hundreds of thousands and millions of Christians who've been displaced, who are internally displaced persons who are living without um, without access to shelter and sustained income, who've been driven from their lands, their ancestral homelands, who've been forced out of their cities in terror, if they've even survived and have seen the deaths of their loved ones, their sisters and brothers, their sons and daughters, their wives or husbands. Voice of the Martyrs has a newsletter, and a few months ago, one of the newsletters focused on Nigeria, and the stories are heartrending when you actually read the testimonies from widows or from children who've lost their parents to Muslim attacks. It's heartbreaking, and one of the worst parts of this is that the world collectively has ignored their suffering. They've essentially turned a blind eye. Now, of course, there's some Christian organizations and charitable groups who have highlighted the plight of Nigeria's Christians, but for the most part, the governments throughout the world have ignored them. In fact, the Trump administration was the first American government to actually exert some sort of pressure on Nigeria, which has been complicit in the widespread misery and suffering of Christians within that country. These are citizens of Nigeria who've been subjected to unspeakable horror from the Muslim population in collusion with the Nigerian Muslim government. And Donald Trump was the first president to actually put a spotlight on this and to exert some kind of pressure on the Nigerian government, which has otherwise just been a recipient of American largesse. And it's horrifying to think about this. None of this has been brought to light by the media, which has collectively ignored this. You almost never see a story on the national news about the suffering of Nigerian Christians. This is something that is simply ignored, even though the Christians there are being subjected to unspeakable cruelty. And as Paul said when he was quoting uh, a psalm that described the suffering of believers, they're being subjected to this all day long. They lay down their bodies to be slaughtered, and the media has ignored this for years, as, with the exception of the Nigerian girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram, which ignited this short-lived Twitter hashtag campaign. You'll hear almost nothing about this issue from mainstream media platforms. And you have to wonder why. You can contrast this with what's happening in the Ukraine, where you're given a daily update on whatever Russian atrocities are committed, or whatever attacks Russia makes on Russian civilians, they're repeated endlessly. Now, uh, there are a number of plausible explanations for this. You can say that this is because this is happening in Europe, ergo it's more important to the United to American citizens. But I don't think that's the case, because um there are a number of very important European issues that never um the media, the American media, never devoted a tenth of the amount of airtime that they do to this conflict. I think it's because there's no concern about something like Christians being slaughtered in any part of the world, but particularly Nigeria, whereas the media has a vested interest in highlighting the depredations of whatever villain du jour they've conjured up. In this case, Vladimir Putin. So they have an interest in hyping up Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukraine, and prolonging the agony of this war, whereas the daily sufferings, and a Nigerian Christian is killed almost every other day. So they have no interest in exposing what's happening in that country, because they don't have any concern about about the lives of Christians, and they don't feel it's newsworthy, despite this being arguably one of the most important news stories over the past 2 decades. They don't deem it worthy of news coverage for some reason. And I think when you contrast these two issues, it gives you a more clear-eyed perspective on the problems with ingesting any sort of information you get from mainstream media sources. This is one of the issues with voting in general. You have a population whose minds are being manipulated through what they see. Oh, hi, Jerry. Uh, their minds are being manipulated through what they see and hear from what are essentially propagandists. They're no different than the people who wrote for Pravda in the USSR, or who write for Grandma in Cuba. They're paid, and they enthusiastically embrace a set agenda that doesn't necessarily coincide with the interests of American citizens. And I think that's the issue here. You're getting all of this, what's essentially disinformation, and that's a word that's been bandied about over the past few months, and which the media has weaponized to suppress any sort of dissenting opinion or news that conflicts with their perception of how the world works. So, but they are actually the ones clinging to disinformation, which is essentially misleading news or lies that are lies, but which are disseminated in order to foster a certain attitude towards specific people or events. Yeah, there is an information war at play, and I think that's what you've seen over the past few months. Instead of realistically reporting on what's been occurring on the ground in the Ukraine and the options for Ukraine and the options for third parties to this conflict, like the United States and the EU and NATO, had essentially a cheerleading squad instead of instead of instead of, and this is a bit of a tangent, but instead of having a news media which simply recounts the facts on the ground and the options available, you have them wanting to affect a certain outcome. And ironically, I think it's made the options for that party, actually it's diminished the best available outcomes. But the but as I said, the way that this colors the minds of people who aren't discerning, who don't actually investigate for themselves and gather information and analyze it for themselves, but simply rely upon the opinions of talking heads and news anchors, it has disastrous consequences. And this is one of the one of the consequences. You have a country where millions of innocent Christians are suffering because no one is aware of the plight that they're undergoing. It's really astounding when you look at how manipulative the media is, and it's not just in this case. You can cite 100 examples off the top of your head, whether it's the war in Iraq, the manufactured conflict in Libya, which destabilized an entire country and then led to the destabilization of Europe through an increase in Muslim migrants and refugees fleeing that country. Syria, the conflict in Syria, and the jihadists who were bankrolled by the United States. If you want to go even farther back than that, the conflict in Kosovo and the Bosnian War. There are just so many. The examples are innumerable. You can just go on and cite fact after fact where the media misled people and lied and deceived people, and yet they will never be labeled exponents of misinformation and disinformation, regardless of how many times they lie. That you'll never hear the Washington Post or the New York Times or NBC News described as disinformation agents or be brought to account for misleading the American public. Yeah, that's another issue. This tendency to instill fear and anxiety, to stir up negative emotions. And ironically, it's never negative emotions towards the people who are the guilty parties, particularly the media itself. They try to continually exonerate themselves and crown themselves in glory. CNN is a perfect example of this. Someone like Brian Stelter, who is one of the worst individuals on the air, he never ceases to praise himself or his colleagues, regardless of how much how much misinformation and how many lies they propagate. It's astonishing. And Neil, if you want to read a good book, Neil Postman wrote a book entitled Amusing Ourselves to Death, which actually does a great job of exploring this issue. The way the way that television news is framed. And he has a great observation in this book where he he states that the criticisms of TV, when people criticize TV, they'll attack it for being frivolous. They'll attack it from the perspective of entertainment and say that the entertainment is rotting people's minds, is essentially you're wasting, and to a certain degree I think that's a quasi legitimate critique. There are a lot of people that simply spend their entire day watching Netflix drama, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's a good thing. But Postman makes a brilliant observation in this book, namely that that's not the problem with TV. That's actually the best part of TV: scripted dramas, situation comedies, to a large extent, even though back in the 80s, television was not. um, it was more film where you got more creative, clever screenwriting. But putting that aside, that's not what's wrong with TV. He concedes in this book that's actually probably the best part of TV, the fiction side. If you think of the Twilight Zone, for example, that simply wasting hours watching TV, that is probably the best part aspect of television. The worst part is the part that bills itself as serious informational programming. That's and he goes on to describe why. And I would recommend, if you want to read a great book, purchase or find a copy of Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's a very short. It's around, I think, 230 pages or so, maybe a little bit less, but he does a great job of analyzing the real problem with television, which is this pseudo information being injected into the bloodstream of American society. and the photo is the cover art is brilliant and has, a bunch of empty basically a family of empty clothing. Clothing, they're disembodied and sitting in front of a television. But that's the real problem: this pseudo information billed as serious programming, sandwiched in between 30-second advertisements for Alka-Seltzer and Wendy's. Although these days it would probably be advertisements for marijuana. but that's the real issue here. It's not frivolous sitcoms or TV dramas, however however addictive those are. It's the attempt to inform people who are watching television. I think the same applies today in the internet age. And this is something that people are not aware of. They're in general. I'm not saying the people watching me obviously are cognizant of these things, but in general, the type of people that go out and mindlessly cast a ballot for their preferred candidate and watch MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, they're just not aware of these things. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about that. I'm coming on a half hour, so I think I'll wrap it up. But I just wanted to give you some food for thought when you're reading these stories about what's occurring in the Ukraine or whatever global hotspot is is attracting attention. So Jerry, CK, Alejandro, GW, everyone who's watching, I appreciate it. Don't have any hesitation about sharing this. I think I'm approaching 560 subscribers. Hopefully the channel will grow. I'll be able to. Hopefully people will actually get notified of my videos. Here's hoping.